Okay, so the last time we left off, this was the screen that we were working with. We had added some gauges and configured those and configured an analog input. And I stated that I was going to continue to work with this layout and add some more gauges to it. And after I stopped the video, I accidentally swiped across the back button on my tablet, and this is what I ended up with. So just after I closed the video, this is what happened. It went backspace on the tablet, and then when I opened up my layout that I had made, I hadn't saved any of those changes. So that was a good reminder for me to let you know that as you're adding gauges, when you install a new one onto your layout, just go ahead and hit save after you've configured it. Like any computer program, it's best to save your work as you're working with it. So one thing, because of this and some other issues that we were working with the video, Morris has already made several little changes, and I've downloaded the latest update. And let me go back to show you, back to main menu. So the main menu hasn't changed. And if you come up here, since it's basically reverted back to beta testing while we do all these changes and tweaks, you'll see that the version number hasn't changed, but this is the latest update. The miscellaneous menu now looks a little different. It's configured differently. There were several other items that were listed individually, but now they're grouped together. Just selecting on them again, the program settings is pretty much the same as we saw before. The config tables, now when you click on that block, you get a pop-up window that allows you to pick the different tables that you want to look at. The individual tables haven't changed much as far as the layouts of that goes. The display and MPSCI link screen, this is the screen that you use to do the download to the device, and we'll show that in a later video. And then again, the layout screen allows you to work with layout, building a gauge dashboard, and configuring gauges as far as appearance. So that test that I was working with is rendered sort of useless. This is the one that I started working on since then. This is what I was going to continue to work with the old one. So you can see some of the gauges that we had in place, and I've added some additional ones. I'm going to pop back to that old configure because I want to show you a couple of the updates that have to do with the gauges and the layout. So you can see on our speedometer and our tachometer here that the font is really small, and in our other layout, which I've saved, I've already reconfigured all of the fonts to be larger. One thing that'll be a help when you're installing all these gauges onto your layout now, if we're going to add an additional gauge, again, you just click on one of the gauges that's on the screen, you'll get the pop-up window. I'm going to go to Add Gauge. You have to confirm that you do want to add a gauge, and I'm going to add an analog gauge to show you a change. And I'm going to add an analog gauge of coolant just for illustration. There it is. You can see now when that gauge was added that the font sizes are different. And the reason for that is on the other layout, I've reconfigured the fonts for a default. And how I did that was if you click on a gauge now, the action pop-up window, you can see that there's additional actions that weren't in the last video. And the additional actions down here are to save as default and delete default. So if I want to make a change, let me set this back. The font size for this gauge, I'm going to set that as default. If I add another gauge, I'm going to first move this out of the way. If I add a new gauge now, again, you can click on any of the gauges to bring up the pop-up window. Add a new gauge, and I'm going to pick the same gauge, an analog, and I'm going to pick coolant. Now you can see when I added it previously, it had the larger fonts. Now I've reset my default for an analog gauge to have those fonts that were in this configuration. So it reset everything back to a smaller font size because I had used the existing speedometer as my new default, the settings that are in this configuration. I'm going to close that without any changes and just go back to the one that I've already changed the font sizes, and I'm going to save that as default. Now, one thing you have to do is you do have to go and configure each gauge type individually. So later, I'm going to delete this gauge. When you want to add a new gauge that is a different type, now I have already in my other layout added a left analog, a digital gauge, a bit gauge, and vertical bar. And I've already configured all of those for the larger font size, but I don't believe I have done a right analog. So if I pull this up, it should have the smaller font size. And I went right past the coolant. And you see the font size is small, just like the speedometer and the tachometer that are already on the screen. I'm going to first resize this. And now I'm going to go and configure those changes. I want my defaults to be 25 font size because of this large tablet. And then the value, I want it to be larger. I'm going to select the 35. Again, Morris is working on a fix for being able to confirm that as an entry so you don't have to select another value. And now you can see that's larger font size. If I don't save that as a default though, let me first move this out of the way. If I don't save that as a default, however, and I add it again, add a new right analog gauge, I'm just going to select battery voltage. You can see that the font size has not been saved. It's still the standard default. If you click on the gauge with the configuration that you want to save as default, and then save as default, you do get an indication, little pop-up message saying that that type has been saved. I'm going to delete this battery voltage that we just added and then re-add it. Clicking on any gauge to bring the pop-up window. Right analog. Battery voltage. And you can see the overall size of the gauge doesn't get saved, but that's the first thing that you'll probably change when you add it to your screen, is size it for however you're planning on installing it on your screen. So there's one simple tool to save your font sizes and configure the gauges and save them as defaults. I'm going to stop this video and then we'll move on to a new topic.